Well, thanks for joining us this afternoon. I'm Tony Karakis. I'm the host and moderator for this very timely podcast. I know that we're all going through many upheavals in the last 2 weeks. It's been a big challenge for human resources, and SpriggHR and LawyersInHouse wanted to bring you this webinar to provide you with an update on legislative changes, their impact, talk about communication to employees, and also best practices working from home as employees start to work from home. Let me talk a little bit about today's speakers. We've got Christine Holmes. Christine is a lawyer and former in-house counsel at Cineplex Entertainment and PepsiCo. Christine left in-house counsel and founded Lawyers In-House, a virtual law firm comprised solely of in-house counsel. They provide business, practical legal advice, and work with companies of all sizes, from startups to scale-ups to large enterprise. Welcome, Christine. Also with us is Jelaine, and she's the founder and president of SpriggHR. As a senior HR professional with over 25 years of direct HR and organizational development experience. She's held senior leadership roles across a number of high-profile organizations, including Lavalife, Canadian Tire, Bombardier, and Cineplex. For the past 10 years, Jelaine and her team have been intensely passionate about delivering performance management experience to clients in a clear, simple, and cost-effective way while reflecting current trends and industry needs with SpriggHR. And I'm Tony Karakis, the moderator. This is an interactive as much as we can, given the amount of content we need to cover. We wanted to make it interactive. And what you can do is you can ask questions, and I will moderate the questions and we'll try to address them at the end. You'll notice that there's a panel, and if you click the red button, it will open up a box, and there'll be a section called questions. You can type your questions, and I will moderate those and refer them to the panelists for answering. So without further introduction, let's get started. And and today's session will be available as including the PowerPoint and all kinds of related tools and checklists are going to be available after the webinar, and you'll have those as a resource. So let's talk a little bit about what we're going to cover. I mentioned we've had unprecedented workplace upheaval, HR managers and HR at the front line, along with leaders trying to deal with all of the changes, communication needs, and issues coming their way. There's also been a large-scale need for new technology or thinking through how we use technology. People who've never worked from home are working from home. How do you manage this? Do managers have the skills? Do we have the technical requirements? And how do we maintain workplace culture and dialogue? Also, there are other considerations. There are roles where employees can't work from home, and we have to manage commuting, social distancing in the workplace, and some isolation. How does HR cope with all of that? Also, rapidly changing environment, and Christine will update us on the legal and regulatory changes, but those change hourly and daily, both in Canada and the United States. At Sprig, we're all about good conversation, so I'm going to stop talking and take us over to Christine, who will provide us with the legislative update. Thanks, Christine.
Thanks, Tony. Appreciate it. And just to reiterate what Tony said, thanks everyone for taking the time to join us today. It's definitely uncertain, and in lots of cases, for lots of us in our positions, unprecedented times. So there's lots going on out there. So we appreciate and are grateful that you're taking a few minutes out to have this conversation, and hopefully it'll be great information exchange for everyone. So as Tony mentioned, the legislation is being introduced and passed globally at a pretty extraordinary rate. we've seen these changes in the UK, EU, Canada, United States, all revising or proposing to revise current legislation in an effort to manage and mitigate these extraordinary circumstances. I just want to note that I am called to the bar in Ontario. However, at LawyersInHouse.com, we have lawyers across the country as well as in the US and called to the England and Wales bar. So based on attendees today, we've tried to tailor it for a little bit of high-level information that would be relevant to everyone. As the changes are broad in healthcare industry, emergency measures acts, tax laws, as far as mortgage relief, we're seeing lots and lots of discussions. Obviously, key to our discussion today are the revisions made to employment legislation and the support measures being introduced or proposed to be introduced for employers and employees. If we take a quick overview of some of the key legal changes, so just yesterday in the US, the Families First Coronavirus Response Act was passed. So, this is a new federal emergency paid leave for employees infected, quarantined, or caring for someone infected and quarantined, or caring for someone due to a closure. And these are paid benefits for employees not receiving unemployment compensation or money from an employer. So again, keeping things really high level due to time and the amount of material we want to cover. Just a note, as Tony said, changes are happening rapidly. I do know there's been discussion in the Senate about further plans to include large corporate tax cuts and also putting limits on the paid leaves. So I'm not quite sure. I have no further updated information on that, but just as a caveat. In the UK, we're seeing the same kind of thing, the coronavirus bill, looking at statutory sick pay, waiving waiting periods, and reimbursing small businesses for the costs of paying sick pay. Here in Canada, looking at it both federally and provincially. So federally, just really quickly, some changes to EI. Again, waiving the waiting periods, medical certificates not being required in certain circumstances, the support being retroactively applied back to January. That's the case as well in the UK and in the US. Small business wage subsidies also being discussed. So right now on the table is about 10% up to 250, or sorry, up to, if only it was 250,000, up to $25,000 per employer. Also changes to the work share programs, outlining specific changes for specific industries, including increase of the agreement length. Right now, it's set at 38 weeks and extending that to 76. And then also the federal government's been talking about tax deferral programs. This is both for employees and employers as far as filing and paying taxes owed. When we look at the provincial, just a quick overview of some of the provinces, what they're, several of the provinces have yet to propose any changes. So I don't want you to think I'm ignoring some of them. Just touching on some of the key ones from the discussions that we've seen come to light so far. So just yesterday, Ontario released the Employment Standards Amendment Act, and this has been quoted in the media as job protection. And this is for if an employee is under medical investigation, supervision, or treatment. If an employee needs to care for someone for a COVID-19 related reason, for example, school or daycare closure. If an employee is unable to return to Ontario due to travel restrictions. And the thing to note here is there's a broad definition of caring for someone. This isn't just the child or parent relationship. This goes to nieces, nephews, aunts, and uncles, and it also includes, quote unquote, someone who is like family. So it's a very broad definition. And the employer can ask for reasonable evidence, but it's actually prohibited to ask for a medical note. I think obviously the reasoning here is not to burden our healthcare system and workers any more than they already are. And one last note, just that this applies to full-time employees, part-time employees, student workers you might have, temporary and casual employees. So in BC, we're seeing a lot of the same type of conversations. Again, extending EI eligibility to self-employed people and to part-time workers. Quebec has instituted a new or proposed a new assistance program, PAT. And this is if an employee doesn't receive revenue from any other source, EI or an employer, they can be eligible for up to $573 a week for 4 weeks. And just also note where the states of emergencies have been declared. So last time I checked, which was before this morning, hopefully this is current and up to date, Ontario, BC, Yukon, and New Brunswick have declared a state of emergency. Alberta has declared a state of health emergency. The US has declared a state of emergency, as well as several of the states within the US. To date, the UK has not declared a state of emergency. And the reason I raise this is that there's specific legislation that could come into effect and impact you and your organization if such a measure is declared in your area. So one example would be in Ontario, in the Employment Standards Act, there is a section for emergency leave. And this gives employees the right to take a leave due to the emergency. It's an unpaid leave, but they have that right, just like any other leave that they could take under the ESA. So again, just something to note depending on the jurisdiction. So how do you stay informed and keep up with everything that's going on? Not certainly not easy today. So I think really the best advice, and I'm sure you're practicing it and hearing it from others, get informed, not scared. Perspective is everything, and knowing the facts. So I always, well, everyone cautions about getting information from social media, but I also caution for you in your positions as legal HR, just business owners, leaders of the organization that people are looking to. I caution you to get your information even from news sites or newspapers. Not that the information there wouldn't be factual, it's going to be a high level summary. For those of you who need to create policies or implement policies, you really need the specifics. When you look at the news sites that talk about the Ontario government's passing legislation so that no employee will lose their job. Well, I mean, one, we all know that's not going to be the reality, but two, how do you change that into an actionable policy and process for your organization? So I recommend going to the government sites, look at the proposed bills, amendments, legislation, legal sites, or any professional sites, from an HR or legal perspective, where you're actually getting the key facts that will be helpful to you. And again, always keeping your specific company in mind. What is your industry? How does it impact your industry? What jurisdiction are you operating in? Lots of companies operate in multiple jurisdictions, whether it's provincial or state, or whether it's multinational. You're probably used to, if that's the case, making sure you're complying with applicable laws in different areas. But with things changing so rapidly, it's just something else to think about. How there could be nuances in the different areas. And also, is your closure mandatory? We've had folks that have, until, for example, in Ontario, were planning on having employers come to work, or sorry, employees come to work and work through in a safe manner as best as they could. And then Ontario went and called the state of emergency. So, example, cinemas or independent schools. All of a sudden, the plans that you had set up are thrown out the window, and you can't control that. And then, even, is working from home an option for your employees? There's lots of conversations about, how do we work from home? In some cases, it's not possible. If you've got employees and you're running a pharmacy or a supermarket or manufacturing. So, there's a lot of information out there and people telling you, here's what you need to do. But, you really need to step back and filter that to, one, does this by law apply to me? And two, how can we make sense of it given our situation? So, talking a little bit about health and safety. So, with COVID-19 and what does it mean, and a lot of questions that we're seeing from our clients and businesses in general. So, I just wanted to bring some of them up here to see if they resonated with any of you. So, number one, can an employer mandate that an employee works from home? And the short answer is yes. If you have reason to believe that an employee could create an unsafe workplace, or if all of your employees being together in close proximity would create an unsafe workplace, you have the right to mandate that they work from home. You still have your employer obligation to keep your workplace safe. So that hasn't changed. The important thing to note here is it just cannot be done in a discriminatory manner. So it can't be that I'm sending home everybody with kids because I'm afraid they might get it from their kids and everybody else gets to stay. So as long as it's reasonable and not done in a discriminatory manner, you have that right. And in some cases, you have that obligation as an employer. Can an employee, on the flip side, can an employee refuse to come to work? And again, the short answer there is yes. If the workplace is considered likely to endanger the employee, they do not have to attend. Now, there is a obligation on the employee to make sure they're acting reasonable. I think the difficulty with the situation at hand will exactly be that, different people's anxiety levels, stress levels, and what is considered reasonable given that, the World Health Organization, I think 7 days ago, declared a global pandemic, and it is fastly spreading. So I think, that's a tough one. I think it's more likely than not that the employee will be seen as acting reasonable in most cases. Can an employee ask to work from home because schools or daycares are closed? Again, short answer, yes. There is, again, here an obligation on employees to make sure that they've exhausted all alternatives. So if you know, or your employee has advised you, they have perhaps grandparents or a live-in nanny who hasn't left and is still with them, and they say, but I'd like to work from home because the schools are closed. That is a circumstance where you can say, well, if you have an alternative and we need you here, and this is not unsafe for you to be here, then that's a situation where you can say they need to work, come into the office or to the plant or wherever. But you cannot, if they have no reasonable alternative, you cannot refuse their request to work from home. This would be considered discrimination under pretty much every human rights legislation. It could be seen as discriminating against them based on their family status. Another question is, I've heard from a lot of employers, is can we use sick days and vacation days to cover the leaves due to the virus? And again, generally, yes. Instead of unpaid leaves or having employees apply for EI, I think everyone's going to be encouraged to be as flexible and creative as possible. And I have an asterisk here for you to check your employees, and as I'll discuss a little bit later, and as Jelaine will touch on as well. I'm not saying that this is not the time to check your policies and say, oh, well, there's nothing in the policy, or the policy, this doesn't apply to the policy, so it can't happen. This is the time to check your policies and change them and make them relevant. If any situation is going to show you the glaring gaps in policies to deal with these types of situations, it's this one. So it's time to update those policies given these measures. And how can employers keep the workplace safe? So, as mentioned, your duty to maintain a safe workplace still applies in the pandemic or a state of emergency. We've all heard lots about social distancing, physically moving workstations, or moving the distance between people working. I'd recommend either closing public gathering areas, or having a couple people work in those areas so there's less, people aren't kind of side by side, is if possible, again depending on your workplace. Obviously cleaning the work surfaces and offices more frequently, and maintaining an open communication policy is always important, but also in practice it's really going to be important for the functioning of your organization that your employees feel safe to come to you, to tell you someone at home has contracted the virus or has symptoms, or I think I have symptoms, and they can't be afraid of reprisals or punitive behavior. And any type of behavior like that from an employer will more likely than not lead to liability. And then again, send employees home if they have symptoms or you believe there's reasonable possible exposure on their front. And that's not just a suggestion, that ties into your duty to keep the workplace safe. So although we hope not to be in the situation of having to discuss layoffs and terminations, there's a new economic reality out there that I think we'd be remiss not to mention it. So again, just a reminder: all applicable employment legislation still applies. So unless an act or a regulation is specifically amended by the governing body in your jurisdiction, it still applies even in a state of emergency, even in a global pandemic. So if you're looking at layoffs, always check your employment agreements with your employees. What do they allow for? What does the employment legislation allow for in your area? Have there been any amendments? And again, having a discussion with employees for um, possible creative or consensual changes. And terminations, the same thing, keeping in mind the laws, the employment laws, the human rights legislation. I think a couple of potential issues that could arise out of this circumstance. One is discrimination. If people feel they have been mistreated, or that a company did not follow even its revised and updated policies and procedures because they were diagnosed or exposed, or taking care of people at home. And I think the other possibility is longer notice or pay in lieu of notice periods. Now, this obviously isn't applicable in the US that has employment in will, but by and large, that's the only jurisdiction in the world that has employment at will. So for the rest of us, I think the courts normally look at factors of how long will it take someone to find alternative employment. And I don't think it's unreasonable to think that the courts, in considering some of these cases in the future, will recognize, we're looking at a downturn in the economy. We're looking at majority of businesses being closed in some areas, people being told not to leave their house. It's going to take longer for people to get a job. So I would recommend upfront maybe extending a longer notice period or pay in lieu of notice period if you're in a position where you need to terminate. And creative solutions. This is a time, as Jelaine will discuss, this is a time for open communication and really having those conversations as a group and trying to get through it together. So having a conversation and saying, we don't want to have to let you go. Can we reduce your hours? Can we reduce your pay? And getting consent from the employee and having the discussion to do that. Of course, always make sure you get it in writing, write up a new agreement, both of you sign it. You do have the right, again, this is speaking to jurisdictions outside of the US, you do have the right to slightly modify and reduce hours of work and pay. But obviously you need to be careful there that you don't end up with a constructive dismissal claim and the employee saying, you've unilaterally changed the terms of my employment agreement. And another creative solution is job sharing. So is that possible? Perhaps there's two people in the same position. Instead of deciding who to keep, maybe, they both go down to part-time. One comes in 1 week, one comes in the next, or however you can make it work in your organization. So other legal and compliance considerations, just to leave you on this portion of our discussion, is, as I've already stated several times, don't forget to comply with existing laws. What does it mean for employees working from home? So data security and privacy concerns. Who else is at home? Are spouses or partners at home? Are their roommates? Are there nannies or babysitters? Who's listening in? So maybe a reminder for not talking about personal information or proprietary confidential information. If you've got information you need to share in that capacity, doing it via email as opposed to spoken. If they are doing conference calls, reminding them perhaps to have headsets, so at least it's not being Bluetooth or the speakers on and everybody's listening. And again, from a data security perspective, connectivity, how secure are the home networks? If you have already issued company hardware and they have virtual private networks, that VPNs that they log into, and you're set up this way, great, you don't have those concerns. But for the rest of the organizations that aren't set up that way, what does that mean? And what does that mean from a security perspective? Because unfortunately, we do know that there tends to be a rise in scams and breaches or attempted breaches from both a cybersecurity standpoint and a phishing standpoint in these types of scenarios, because they're expecting people to be distracted. So probably just a time again to reiterate and or update your policies, reminding employees of their confidentiality duties, reminding them of the privacy legislation, making sure they're not printing or downloading things at home or sending them to personal email addresses, because they don't have to connect through a VPN in order to read them, and just keeping those top of mind. And again, review the policies. And this leads into the last discussion point about compliance issues, not speaking here directly to regulated industries, but talking about your own internal compliance policies and procedures. It's a really good time, as I'm sure you probably already have, to review all those policies and what do they say and what do you need them to say. And I know some employers and leaders are saying, we don't want to put into place, we don't want employees thinking, this is the new norm, and we change everything in all of our policies. Don't forget, they're temporary changes. Just like all of these legislated changes, they all have expiry dates. They can be extended, as can your policy, but these are all temporary measures that either expire at the end of the pandemic or the state of emergency, or as I said, at a stated expiry date, and they can be renewed. So it doesn't have to be, well, I'd like to put this policy in place about people working from home, but I don't want people to think this is the way it's going to be when everything goes back to normal. So keep that in mind, but it's a really good time to be creative, figure out how we can manage these types of situations. Hopefully, this isn't going to be our new norm for a cold and flu season. But I think it's probably not going to be the last time, we have to deal with something like this. So it's a great time to think of things differently and put in some best practices that make times like this a little bit easier to deal with in the future.
Thanks a lot, Christine. That was a great overview. If anybody has any further questions for Christine, then feel free to type them into the question box, and she will try to address them, time permitting. The other consideration is we've added into the handouts tab in the control panel of this webinar a variety of checklists and tools, some of which relate to what Christine's been talking about. How do you deal with employees working from home, and confidentiality, data management, electronic document management, tools to sign documents and store them. So we have a number of added resources in that panel. And now you've got employees working from home, managers dealing with a new scenario where they aren't seeing the people they work with, employees not seeing each other. How do managers cope with that? What are the communication plans, tools, and tactics you have in place to keep not business as usual, but to explain to employees what is taking place and make sure that you're keeping calm through the organization as much as you can? So for that, Jelaine Parks will address some of those concerns.
Thanks a lot, Tony, and thanks a lot to you as well, Christine. Some of the content that Christine covered, I'm going to echo or parrot a little bit of that, just in terms of some overlap. But I'm going to speak primarily just about communication plans. And the biggest question is, do you have one? And then we'll talk a little bit about the work from home piece. And as Tony's already mentioned, we're providing you in your handouts some veritable checklists. And by the way, just from a design standpoint, those are ready to hand out. Those aren't necessarily designed for HR people as much as they are for people, HR people, to hand out to employees. So they are ready to be distributed. I've left them just in a Word format so that you can modify accordingly. But in terms of communication, I'm going to talk at this from two perspectives. So organizational, in terms of what's appropriate from a company-wide point of view, and then we'll talk a little bit about what's it like to be a leader in these times, because that is a really big shift in terms of managing people. And in all fairness, lots of leaders are subject matter experts on the ground, and quite a lot are learning on the fly in terms of managing people. But managing people from afar is just a completely different dynamic. So the number one thing that I would emphasize is, in terms of communication, is being proactive. And so the more that you can be proactive, the more fluidly your team and your employees can naturally operate. So part of that would be your regular updates. Again, common sense prevails. So daily interaction, even a company-wide video, is a highly recommended tool. And best case that I can think of is even our own Justin Trudeau, Canadian Prime Minister, where he's done a job in terms of communication strategy, where he's instilling a sense of calmness and information management, and even caring. And that's a big deal because we can see him, and we can see the leader's face in this case. So another highly recommended piece is to tell people what you know and what you don't know. Everyone, I think, and we spoke as presenters earlier today, that this is a pretty dynamic environment right now. And things are changing quite literally by the hour. Don't be afraid to provide that perspective, or to admit it, and that you will in fact update and inform later with future communications. So all basic good judgment stuff. Keep it simple, keep it fact based, and be sincere, be transparent about, again, what you know and what you don't know. The Harvard Business Review talks about testimonials from CEOs in the past who have lived through mergers and acquisitions, and their best piece of advice to you is just to over communicate. So err on the side of, again, communicating more than your typical, that's for sure. In a changing environment like this, midday updates are certainly welcomed, particularly this time, and even make your choice in terms of the frequency. So quite a few people we're talking to are bookending it. So they're doing started days in terms of scrums. So they'll gather their team online and they'll speak to them directly. And then they'll touch base again directly at the end of the day. All kinds of flex. I think this is very much the new norm, and I love Christine's comment about the fact that it's not the new norm forever. So we'll look to manage expectations around everything in terms of policies and communications as we move forward. But other suggestions talk about platforms that can be branded and updated and easily recognized by perhaps a subject and a color. So a great example of that is a collaboration platform such as Slack. I don't know if any of you or many of you are familiar with it. Pretty common instant recognition, or rather instant communication tool. Collaboration platform. You can in fact create a channel, a devoted channel that talks to this specific topic. So it's up to you. But employees, and I love this piece, is that employees are like your audience. I used to work in an organization that was steadfast in the core value of treat the people that you work with like you would your best customer. And I think that is absolutely critical in this time, where we want to be able to convey largely a lot of information to people, again, erring on the side of overly communicating. Now, just in the way Tony's commented already around some tools and and information sharing that we've provided, which you can download right now as handouts. Another great resource to which we're happy to follow up with is a group called RHR Global Consultants. They have a white paper that is excellent for this time, revealing what are 4 concepts for leaders in dealing in what are very uncertain times. And they've got guidelines that apply to everyone, and not just your employees, but also your customers. So inform, connect, guide, and unite. So just as a very quick mention, and I'm going to make completely clear here that we have quite a few SpriggHR clients who are logged into the system right now. Your communication platform is essential. And just as a reminder, you do have these tools and these features at your fingertips. So you have a communication realm, what is known to most of you as continuous feedback. You actually have the tools and the ability to remask this into what is a COVID-19 update. And you even have a company info tab where you can centralize, access, and manage all of the relevant and pertinent information that you're trying to share with employees. So all of that can actually be shared readily. And then other types of communication platforms that really help you centralize, access, and manage. The most common, certainly amongst our client groups, would be the company intranet and generating a devoted folder. Now, albeit there may be some delays and some time constraints when setting up home VPNs, but nevertheless, that content should be centralized and made available. I've touched on Slack already in terms of creating a unified or a unique channel. Microsoft Teams is another great collaborative platform and excellent for the video-faced broadcasts from your president, where he or she can again provide that reassurance to the groups and to the employees. GoToMeeting, which is LogMeIn, is a offering, and I'm not entirely sure where they're at in this process, but I know a couple of days ago they were doing a brilliant extension of their services by offering free accounts to their current customer groups just to be able to accommodate that work from home piece. And so all of those vendors are made available and accessible online. Moving into what are more manager related, so from an organizational lens and getting into what is it that leaders are dealing with. And quite a few, again, organizations, this is certainly nothing new, is conducting that check-in. But typically and historically, we've done them in person, of course. But in the realities of today's workforce, that entire arm's length or remoteness, we need to actually engage this more frequently. And this is, in my opinion, from a leadership point of view, critical to be able to do that temperature check, do that check-in with employees, and help them cope with change. So the white paper that I referred to earlier by RHR, we are going to make that available to you as well. They may not be provided on today's handouts, but we'll include it as a follow-up. Talks very specifically about the unpredictable types of behaviors that people will demonstrate during upheaval and extreme times of change, things that you may not be familiar with. And I highly recommend you take a look at that paper and get a semblance around how it is you can anticipate dealing with people. So structured cadence is a big one in terms of the calls and the one-on-ones. Let them hear your voice, and not just at a team level. I would, again, highly recommend that you engage one-on-one, because not everyone is responding the same way or the way that you might expect them to. So a simple, how are you? How can I help? Can we share each other's expectations during this time? Unstructured calls, and even promote that regular check-in on a single voice-to-voice. We'll talk a little bit about in a couple of minutes, and I just want to be mindful of our time today. We definitely want to leave some time at the end for Q&A. Equipment and data security, certainly in our business, it is cornerstone to how we manage data. VPN access and home computer storage have all kinds of content and information sharing concerns that you really need to be aware of. So right from the confidentiality and the information sharing, if people, are they using their personal computers? Are they using a company computer? If they're using their personal computers, they really shouldn't be downloading or printing or sharing information in that capacity. So there's I think Christine and both Tony noted this. It's definitely a good time to revisit your policies and to update those accordingly. I think people have huge amounts of flexibility and forgiveness during this time, but nevertheless, as leaders and professionals in this area, they're looking to us to be able to guide them as effectively as possible. So confidentiality is certainly a critical one, trying to protect data, even printing out copies, leaving it around, clearing one's desk space, one's personal space from home. I think Christine did a great job in talking about the health and safety components. And I know the client groups that I'm speaking to, you can imagine, our core business is HR people. And most of them are pretty radio silent right now as they scramble, quite literally, to implement their pandemic plans. And I would highly recommend, in addition to today's conversation and information sharing, you get to Service Canada. It's a great repository of the latest public health agency of information around Canadian facts, at least within the coronavirus and the updates and regular changes. So it's a work in progress. Again, Employment and Social Development Canada, for the bulk of our audience today, will offer you some very, very critical information. Hours and flex, Christine talked about this from an EI standpoint. You have an obligation as an employer. Particularly on the client-facing component, where we ask employees, and you'll see and note this in some of the checklists made available to you, we ask employees to make arrangements if they have to take care of children or if they're a caregiver themselves, to make sure that things are covered from a client perspective. This is by far business as usual, by far. Now, having said that, I believe that there's a huge amount of focus and real diligence that you can introduce to your people by keeping them focused on their projects at hand. And then lastly, Christine has spoken certainly about the child and the elder care in the accommodation here and the appointments. You have, again, an obligation. And you can't burden people, in addition to our health system, by requiring or demanding notes. I have seen all kinds of dialogue on LinkedIn where employers are forcing people to come to work regardless of their situations. That will very much have a short shelf life. We will have an obligation to be able to promote the safety of our employees. Now, keeping teams working and engaged, that's a huge responsibility from a leader standpoint, particularly if they've never managed a group from afar. And again, all kinds of technology that you can leverage and be made available to you. Have team meetings online, have people's cameras on. And I heard actually the other day just a fantastic example of somebody who's really doing that transition of working from home, where he was really struggling with his family in constant interruption. It was just an optics or a visual thing for him, where his kids would come wandering in, and we've all seen that video with the children that wander in during the actual BBC meeting, but his children would just see it as a license to interrupt him. And so he would get up in the morning. His new practice was he would shower, he would get dressed, he would look the part, and then he would literally say to his family and announce, "I'm going to work now." And he would go to his designated workspace and close the door. And he found that to be that invisible line in the sand where his family did not disrupt him. So all kinds of great practices. And I encourage you, I know my colleagues today talked about social media as not being one of the most reliable sources, but I would highly recommend that LinkedIn, which I believe has a bit of a different professional lens on things, is just fraught with all kinds of great suggestions. I'll leave you with a few more things here, but in terms of coming from a tech environment, we have all kinds of great project management and communication pieces that we operate with on a day-to-day, and look to your tech teams. I mean, a lot of organizations have a technology presence. They have sprints, they have short stand-ups or scrums and short-range plans and various types of project management meetings that are designed specifically to have bursts, short bursts of communication. Okay, so I'm not going to, just in terms of time, spend a whole lot in delving in here. I can tell you that the following areas around work practices and hours of work are reiterated in the handouts made available to you on the checklists. But once again, I believe that policies need to be revisited, as Christine's already said. Typical work hours remain, however, and I think that that's a big communication piece that you can offer when it comes to working from home. You need to have a core set of business hours. I need to be able to understand when I can reach you and when your colleagues can reach you. Now, if overtime or time off needs to be approved, really communicate with your employees to say that there's an expectation there. They need to be able to reach out and let people know where they're at. This is not a policing piece. This is not a Big Brother's piece. This is really about momentum and making sure that people are okay. To assist colleagues in helping each other know where each other is at, we want to be able to sustain as much stride and presence in continuance of work. So I need to know where people are on my team so that I can reach out and have some sort of business continuity there. Periods of sick leave and appointments need to be completely transparent. If there's been any sort of change of hours due to the fact that my children are at home, I was reading an article this morning where an individual says, my best time to reach me is between 8 p.m. and 12 p.m. And certainly does that not translate to people having to respond to emails at 11:23 p.m. But it does mean that that's the safest and most guarded hours. And that's where employers need to show up and offer that kind of flex. So again, during a typical day, this is a pretty expected area, but encourage people to take their breaks. This is a very, very critical piece, especially when someone's not used to working from home. They'll find that they're at their desk quite a bit, and we need to keep people healthy. Okay, very quickly, employees working from home need to find, again, good judgment here, people, just as far as what makes sense, what's practical. I love Christine's remark about, they won't always necessarily have that dedicated extra guest room or private room, but if they can guard that, I would even recommend, and I've done this in other areas, I use earplugs to drown out any sort of background and noise, and then certainly earbuds are one to keep noise at a minimum. Required equipment, supplies, etc., are things that they need to be able to be clear in communication as needs from their workspace, or from their employers rather, and that from a health and safety standpoint, we need to be sure that the people are practical. That's all, and that means not a very extensive amount of cords and complication that way, where people create trip hazards. Again, a lot of this information is available on your checklist. Data security promotes the confidentiality of work and content. Work-related information needs to be stored and locked, ideally within a room, or rather within a desk or file cabinet. Check your policies, update your policies accordingly. Data security, all kinds of really interesting and effective ways, like two-factor authentication, where people can have a code texted to them in terms of protecting their data. If the employee does not have a company laptop, I think I've touched on this already, they'll be able to use their personal one, but with some limitations. And employees have to be sensitive. There needs to be good judgment in play here around confidential information. And again, Christine touched on this, but we have a lot of information that relates to privacy with our clients. And we have to be super mindful in protecting those. And make use of your shared environment, or your environments that promote that, such as SharePoint through Microsoft Office. Employees need to keep the company's normal health and safety policies intact. Again, as Christine's pointed out, you can't bypass the current laws. Make sure that you're not doing that. And don't confuse your policy as the new law. So when you're updating things accordingly, basic things, trip hazards, et cetera, as I've touched on, working from home longer term, et cetera, you may find, as none of us are really in a position to know just how long. I've heard all kinds of opinions around this, but I know in our structure, we look for a photograph of the workspace so that we can ensure that the recommended policies are in fact being adhered to. And again, policies would denote evacuation plans and various other things. Tools and helpful tips, as we mentioned a few times in this broadcast, are made available to you right now as handouts. I will follow up with individuals on this broadcast today with a white paper around leadership in times of uncertainty. And really, again, once again, I emphasize it's 2 or 3 pages in the read, but it's an excellent document. Okay, Tony. Sorry, I wanted to push through there and make sure that we remained some time.
Yeah, just a quick thing for the people on the webcast. Our colleague Zach has already posted the location for that white paper, but Jelaine will follow up after and send that to you. Also, in the handouts, we've included a sample work from home policy, which would be more your enduring policy. The bullets that Jelaine has just covered are more temporary arrangements where you may not have a photograph or a variety of things that you want from the employee's temporary workspace, but you're pushing people to work from home, so you're bending the rules. So speaking of bending rules, many of you had lots of questions for Christine on how not to bend them and staying in the confines of current regulations, even though they are changing rapidly. And Christine has some answers for you. So I wanted to take some time and go back to Christine. If you still have questions for Jelaine, please type them into the question box. But Christine's eagerly awaiting to provide some insights.
Thanks, Tony, and thanks everyone. It's fantastic. We were hoping this could be interactive, and we know we have so much information that we've been trying to share. So apologies, but yeah. So just going through the questions, and I'll try to get to as many as I can. Great questions, and then obviously. Tony, just jump in if there's issues or things that Jelaine needs to address before we wrap up. I'm mindful of the time. So a couple of questions. So we had a question about if an employee's contract does not allow for layoffs, what does that mean? Great question. As you know, employment legislation in different jurisdictions does allow for temporary layoffs. However, that's not an explicit right. You usually need to see that kind of language in an employment contract. So what do you do if you do not say that you have that right in an employment contract and you need to lay someone else? Technically speaking, in the non-emergency, non-global pandemic letter of the law, an employee can treat a temporary layoff as tantamount to an immediate termination of employment, which of course would give rise to a claim for pay in lieu of notice or severance. This approach, I think, is probably a pretty risky approach for employees to take. So if you're considering this as an employee from the employee side, or you have employees who are considering this, I would exercise extreme caution, because I think if your employer comes to you, in light of the COVID-19 outbreak and given, the current economic situation, quite frankly, and says, we need to lay some people off, and, they're in their best efforts trying to deal with the situation, I'm not so sure that the letter of the law as it exists in non-emergency situations would be applied. I think that the law might imply, and again, this is just an opinion, that the employer has a right to implement a temporary layoff as a health and safety measure, or because of work shortages that have arisen in these circumstances. So they're pretty extraordinary circumstances. So I think we need to keep that in mind. Another, hopefully that helps answer. Another great question. Someone asked, what is reasonable evidence? So when we say that an employer has the right to ask for reasonable evidence, this was in relation to the amendments in the Ontario Employment Standards Act, but you're prohibited for asking for medical documentation. I mean, I think really as an employer, I would take that as very lightly. If someone comes to you and says, "Oh, my kids have been exposed at school," and to your knowledge they don't have kids, then perhaps that's not reasonable evidence. But I think, again, given the extraordinary circumstances, I'd keep that bar really, really low. If someone has says, unless you have reason to believe they haven't traveled and they say that they have, it's basically taking public transit into work. If and some people, that's what they have to do, could be considered dangerous, or exposing them to COVID-19. Now, I would argue, perhaps if you're in a more remote rural area and there is no one who has been exposed or is self-isolating for thousands or hundreds of kilometers or miles, is a possibility in Canada, not so much in some other countries, but so maybe it isn't reasonable. So not a direct answer, I know, but there isn't going to be a one shoe fits all for that. But I think what I'd really state is keep the bar low, keep it as low as possible. And again, it's all about discussions and conversations. So, having those with your employees and hopefully, consenting to how you're going to manage different situations. We also had a question about the 30-day wait time for work share. And this is a great question as well. For those of you not familiar, the Workshare program in Canada is a three-way agreement between Service Canada and employees and employers. And Service Canada, generally they say it takes about 30 days to negotiate. There's lots of conversation, and I touched on this even in talking about proposed changes or already passed changes to legislation, where they're saying, okay, we're going to cut the wait time down. We're no wait times for EI. There's a lot of discussion saying this is going to happen. Even if the legislation has been passed, we have to think practically. And I don't mean this offensively if there is anybody who works for the government on the line, but they're large organizations. They're already under-resourced and have probably too much on their desks. So you can imagine what they're going to look like now. So passing legislation to say there's now no, for example, EI waiting period or 30-day negotiation period for the Workshare program doesn't mean that these things are going to be able to happen overnight. There's only so many, and government offices are dealing with all of the same issues as far as employees coming in and working from home as well. So, I mean, the legal response is yes, a lot of these time periods are being looked to be waived, but practically, does that mean that you're going to have an agreement in hand or a check in your hand any faster? Tough to say. And one last thing, sorry, I wasn't able to get to more questions. I just wanted to say quickly that someone asked another fantastic question, which is what's considered a small business. That, of course, depends on jurisdiction. I've had a lot of trouble in Ontario and Canada when they talk about all this proposed new legislation. They're not necessarily specifying the definition of small business. For income tax purposes in Canada, small business is 100 employees or less, or under 500,000 in income. Interesting to note, the US, the legislation that they just passed, a small business is under 50 employees, and the UK in their new legislation has described a small business as under 250 employees.
Quite a range.
Yeah, very much so.
Well, thanks a lot, Christine. There were a number of questions and you were able to answer a number of them. We will be able to send out information afterwards, as Jelaine had mentioned. There's a variety of handouts that you can download off the panel. And I'd like to thank all of you who joined us today. hopefully you were able to walk away with some practical insights and deal with some of the many questions that you're getting in human resources. As mentioned, you're going to get a copy of the broadcast, the shared PowerPoint, and remember that it's really important that you're able to manage the information. As they say in airplanes, when the oxygen mask comes down, put it on yourself first, and then look to help other people. So it's important for HR to manage their own stress and priorities as well. And thanks for joining us today as we try to help you with some of the many priorities you're juggling. Take care, and we will chat to you at some point soon. We may do this again. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Christine and Jelaine.
Thank you.